Hey you guys, welcome back to the channel. It's me, B. Riley, and today we are going to be talking about one of the best values in Fender's vintage tube amp lineup, the Bassman Ten. Stay tuned. Alright, so some of you guys might be old enough to remember during the solid state invasion that took place during the 1970s and the 1980s, where we basically were being handed a bunch of amps over and over again by manufacturers that if you lined them up in a pretty chorus line and turned them all the way up to 10, you still couldn't ever seem to get that noise that you ever wanted. As a matter of fact, one time I actually remember reading an article that was talking about Brian May being at a shop and lining up a row of amps, and no matter how many were stacked up and lined up, that he couldn't quite get them to sound the way that he wanted. So obviously, like we had talked about in the Twin Reverb Tone Master episode, there are always going to be people who favor tube, and there's going to be always those people who are willing to make the concessions for solid state, especially as digital now has really started to get a good hold on how to make that tone without incinerating tons of power. However, for today, what we're going to do is we're going to take a nice simple look at the Bassman 10 that we've got from the mid-1970s. And the reason is because, honestly, these things are stupid cheap. I mean, it is remarkable how little these cost, especially when you can put them next to another tube amp that could cost you $1,500 or $2,000, and it can contend with it. Anyway, here's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to mess around with it. We're going to try to do some different tones. I'm going to do my best to try to make it sound bad, because sometimes the best amps that you find are just those amps that you just can't get a bad sound out of. We'll run it with a couple of different guitars to kind of show you the different tonal spectrums that you can get with different rigs, and we'll run it through some pedals to kind of vary it up a little bit. In the meantime, let's go ahead and plug in and see if we can start getting some noise out of this thing. Okay, so what's it like to carry this thing around and live with it? Well, you know, as it comes down to playability, which is the bracket that we usually talk about second up, it's heavy. I mean, you're talking about an amp that weighs 90 pounds, and much for the same reason that I talked about the Fender Twin Reverb Tone Master being such a blessing with its lightweight, I'm gonna have to admit that as a person who had bought the Twin Reverb Tone Master because I had actually broken my hand a couple times, I actually broke both of them, and carrying them around, you know, when you're over 40 kind of starts to become a bit of a nuisance. This one's a bit heavy. It's 4x10s, and this thing is properly loud. You're going to have all the wattage you need. You've got to remember that when you've got a tube equivalency of, say, 40 or 50 watts, essentially that's kind of like a solid state amp that's running at about 80 or 90. You've got to remember that there's just a little bit more headroom there. The great thing about this thing is you can run it clean or dirty, as you can hear by the tones that we're chucking around in this video. The truth of it is that this amp has a master volume. Now, it's not as variable as a modern amp where you would have a pre-gain stage, or you know, the preamp that you could drive the preamp and leave the power amp alone. And it doesn't have any wattage attenuator or anything like that built in. This is just a, you know, Class A point-to-point hand-wired amp back in the day when that's all you could get your hands on, and its utilitarian simplicity is kind of a huge selling point. If something goes wrong with this amp, just yank a speaker out, yank that tube out, replace it, and it's pretty straightforward. It's something that you could do yourself in a matter of minutes in your own living room. And you cannot set the knobs on this amp in any way in which it sounds bad. It just always sounds good. No matter what you're putting through it, if you're relatively in tune, this thing is gonna do the job. Now, you do lose a little bit of bottom end because you're not using 12s, but it's nothing that can't be made up with a little bit of manipulation of the knobs and just driving those speakers a little bit more heavily. Okay, so regarding the investment value of this amp, this is really straightforward and simple. And the reason is because, as I had mentioned before, they seem to just be persistently cheap. I actually played one of these somewhere in the ballpark of about 12 or 13 years ago when I was still touring with a band and playing original material and things like that. And I actually had one of these. I bought it off of a strange man in Mission Beach who sold it to me for 600 bucks cash. That being said, that wasn't necessarily very little back then, and it wasn't very much. It was about how much the market value was demanding for these, and that was somewhere around 2007 and 2008. Now, essentially, I came into this amp through a couple of decent trades and things like that. I had been looking for it very, very specifically, but upon actually getting my hands on it for a screaming awesome deal from a guy who was super cool and just wanted to trade straight up for an AC30, and I had one that I wasn't using, I went back and revisited Reverb and eBay and started to realize that the prices on these have not moved in about 13 years. I paid $600 for the one that I had many years ago at that time, and I'm seeing them on Reverb going for local pickup only $600 and $700. But I can say this much, that they are only going to get more expensive because there are only going to be less and less of those examples out, available, and up for sale as these models continue to degrade in the hands of those who are not taking very good care of them and continue to appreciate and value by being in the hands of those who do know how to keep them maintained and keep them in good shape and maybe aren't using them as severely as the rest of us. Well, guys, there you have it. Obviously, a good value for the buck, and it sounds the business no matter what you're plugging into it. And, you know, it really does have that, that indescribable versatility that you get in some of those great amps, where you could just plug anything into it, and it picks up that identity, and it really runs with it, and it really allows you to utilize that tone, that specificity of that instrument going through that amp. And in such a way that it doesn't hinder the flavor. You know, if you plug a 12-string into it, it gives you this great Birds chime. If you're plugging a Les Paul into it, it gives you all that great Mick Ronson mid, you know, Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. And, you know, when you're plugging something into it like that Les Paul Special, you obviously get, you know, a very small amp 50s tone, kind of, you know, that those early rock and roll records where they were really just banking on the heat of the pickups to be able to provide sufficient distortion for the type of sounds and tones that they were trying to get. But as versatile as it is, it's utilitarian, it's simple, it's easy to fix, the price is really good, especially when you're comparing it against current Bandmaster prices or Bassman head and cabinet, you know, iterations versus the combo. that, you know, at this current junction, this amp is a lot cheaper than a lot of its competition. And it does it with grace and style, and it has a wonderful tone. So it's cheap, it sounds good, and you don't have to worry about breaking something that's going to cost you a great sum of money to repair later on down the road. Well guys, that's this week's video. Thanks for tuning in and thanks for checking them out. I always like batting these things back and forth. You know, a lot of this stuff is just kind of stuff that's coming into you know, my path while I'm working on some things for other people, or maybe it pops up a screaming deal. And you know, I have a lot of fun making these videos and stuff like that, but more than that, I love hearing your guys' feedback. So be sure to drop down into the comments section. Let me know if maybe you think I forgot something, or maybe if there is another model that you feel would be even cheaper and even of a higher benefit for all the players that are dropping by and seeing what's going on. Anyway, have a beautiful evening, you guys. Be sure to plug in, turn up, play loud as hell if you so have the luxury of doing so today. And we will see you guys next week when we're going to be reviewing a different kind of amp. See you then. Whatever the f that was. Bassman 10, right here on some channel that I'm on. Ow. Shit. I don't know what I'm saying. Okay.